Good evening, everyone, and welcome to, let me just share my screen. Here we go. Welcome to the Special Education Legal Fund webinar series. This is the last webinar of the 25-26 school year, and I really do hope that these have been helpful for everyone. I am Laura Sullivan, and I am the staff attorney for S.E.L.F. Legal Aid. I'm excited tonight to be here with our panel of experts talking about a subject that seems to come up quite frequently. Before we get there, we do have a little bit of housekeeping. So I would like to, thank our corporate sponsors for their support. We could not do the work that we do without them. At our platinum level, we have WealthSpire and Eagle Hill School. At gold level, we have Winston Preparatory School. At our silver level, we have our sponsor for this webinar, Villa Maria School, also American School for the Deaf, Chapel Haven Schleifer Center, Fusion Academy, the Pinnacle School, and the Spire School. And at our bronze level, we have the Windward School and Sasko River Center. If you're not familiar with Special Education Legal Fund, our mission is to provide resources and knowledge to families in need with children in the special education system. S.E.L.F. seeks to empower parents and guardians to fully advocate for their students and to level the playing field for families in need with children in special education. In September 2025, S.E.L.F. began providing direct legal services to qualifying families in the area of special education for students with IEPs in Connecticut through S.E.L.F. Legal Aid. That is my job. S.E.L.F. also currently provides grants for legal support and advocacy to families in need with children in special education system in Connecticut and Westchester County through our attorney grant and advocate grant programs. We are in the end of the last grant cycle for this school year. Grant applications are accepted until May 15th, and then we are closed with grant applications for the summer. They will open up back again on September 1st. The legal aid program has a rolling admission, so you can continue to apply to that as long as we have capacity, which we currently do. And as an attorney, I have to have a disclaimer. So this webinar is presented for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide legal advice, support, or assistance to any individual. Participation in this webinar does not create an attorney-client relationship. The webinar is intended as a general resource for families navigating special education in Connecticut and New York and should not be considered a substitute for the advice and counsel of a qualified special education attorney. Families seeking legal guidance should consult a licensed attorney in their state to discuss the specific needs of their child. And participation in this webinar does not constitute or imply endorsement by Special Education Legal Fund of any speaker, attorney, advocate, organization, or school represented on this panel. I'm going to quickly introduce our panel. Their full bios were available to you with your registration, but just so you know who is here, first we have Naomi Nova. Naomi practices in special education here in Connecticut, and I believe this is her first appearance on a S.E.L.F. webinar. Naomi is also Vice President of Special Education Equity for Kids of Connecticut, known as S.E.L.F. And if you are unfamiliar with S.E.L.F., I suggest you visit their website at seekct.com for more information. Next, we have Dr. Elizabeth Hanaway, Assistant Superintendent of Special Services for Ridgefield Public Schools, and Liz is in charge of Special Education Services. This is also Liz's first appearance on a S.E.L.F. webinar, and I believe the first time we have a school district administrator participating. I think that is it's important that we engage in these discussions with all stakeholders, so I really do thank Liz for her participation. Next, we have Dr. David Perino, who is a clinical neuropsychologist and director of diagnostic testing services at Sasko River Center. Also David's first S.E.L.F. webinar, and I'm excited to have him as he conducts many evaluations on our kids here in Connecticut. And finally, we have our only returning panelist, Advocate Diane Wilcutts, and I think this is Diane's sixth webinar with S.E.L.F., so thank you for your ongoing support, Diane. And I think Diane is equally excited about this topic as I am. So I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. We are recording the webinar, and as a registrant, you will receive a copy of the recording through Eventbrite, likely tomorrow. The recordings are also posted to our Facebook page and eventually make their way to our website, where you can find previous webinars as well, and that is spedlegalfund.org. So if you miss anything, you have the opportunity to watch it again. And we will be monitoring the chat and Q&A section for questions. Please do not submit questions specific to your child for privacy reasons. If questions are relevant to the discussion, we will try to work them in, but we may not get to all questions as we have a very full agenda. So, on to our main event. We're here to talk about how to assess the best school district for your child, which is a really intriguing question to me, and I'm excited for this discussion. So, in diving in, we're going to kind of start with where should the focus be? And David, I'm going to start with you. Parents often start by asking which district is best, but that's usually the wrong opening question. So, what do parents need to understand about their own child before they can evaluate any district or alternative?
Yeah, it's a great opening question. I always tell parents that the best way to understand what your child needs educationally is to really understand how your child's brain works. Right? You don't necessarily need to know every in and out of it as a parent, but you do need kind of a general understanding of your child's their strengths in terms of their learning style, their information processing, their social emotional development. What are some of the more vulnerable areas of their profile? So I think before looking at any school district or really making very significant educational decisions in general for kids with neurodiverse profiles, you want that clearer picture of their general thinking skills, their problem solving, their language processing, attention, executive functioning, memory, and then of course how they're acquiring their academic skills, their reading, their writing, their mathematics. That's a really big component. Um, I think that a lot of parents will jump then to say, "Oh, you mean what diagnosis they have?" Um, you know, it helps to be able to pinpoint what a child's core challenges are, and a precise clinical diagnosis does allow us to plan both educationally and non-educationally. But really figuring out what are the exact areas of difficulty that we're able to pinpoint. I think that that's really important to figure out how your child is going to be best served educationally and questions about goodness of fit with school districts, for example. I think that's an important piece. Um, the last thing I will say is that the physical environment and the social environment really matters, and every child's different. So some children need really structured days with very predictable routines. Others are totally different. They need novelty, they need flexibility, they need a lot of movement breaks, lots of peer opportunities. So I always recommend touring schools, touring programs, just really getting in there and getting in the halls. You can really help get a real sense of what it will be like for your particular child.
Thank you. We're off to a strong start here. Naomi, we're going to pivot over to you. So, when this question comes up, we frequently hear the word best. Is that the legal requirement for schools in providing a program? And what expectations should a parent have around the best?
Okay, so I'm going to say something that you're going to raise your eyebrows at, perhaps. I feel very, very strongly that parents should expect the best. They should expect a rigorous program. They should expect their child to have every opportunity to maximize their skills and their abilities. If you look at school mission statements. Those mission statements are lofty. They are ideal. And they talk about, here, I've got a couple of them to read, to educate all students to the highest levels of academic achievement, to enable them to reach and expand their potential. Another one, to provide an excellent and equitable education, right? This is our ideal for all students. Why should it not apply to SPED students? Um, and I feel very strongly about that. Under the law, when we talk about what is an appropriate education for FAPE, that is a different standard. That standard, as defined by the Supreme Court, is that you have an IEP with specially designed instruction that is targeted to allow the student to make appropriate progress in light of their circumstances. What's appropriate progress? It's not going to be, and you're going to hear this all the time at PPT meetings, it's not the Cadillac. It's not, the highest quality. It's just what's sufficient to make sure that your child is making more than minimal progress, what is appropriate in light of their circumstances. And so that's how the law looks at it.
Thank you. I really appreciate you pointing out that the policies and how we have lofty goals for a lot of students, but our special education students may have a different thing that we're, guiding against. So, Liz, when a parent has a clearer picture of their child, as David kind of referred to, and the supports they need, what options and possibilities should they be proactively asking their school district about? And
Mhm.
who is the appropriate person to have that conversation with?
I want to highlight where you just left off and what David said in terms of really making sure parents are clear from their vantage point of what their children need and starting there rather than starting with the district in terms of what do you have. Yes, the what do you have is an important question, but it really should come after families feel clear for themselves with what their children need. If they have an IEP already, maybe that's defined, but there's always pieces that parents can describe to us and what their children need, similar to what David was talking about with environment, that make a big difference in determining what's appropriate, like Naomi just said. Um, so after kind of what's my child's profile and what do I believe that they need? And you start thinking about, well, what's available and what do districts provide? The most important thing is to talk to somebody who can answer your questions. Ideally, it is the district-wide special education leader, whether it's the assistant superintendent, the director of special education. Please do not hesitate, regardless of somebody's title, to contact them, and that goes all the way up to the top of the district. There's no reason to start an email with "I'm so sorry to bother you" or "I'm sure you're busy." That's what their role is to design programming and to make that information available. So I think that, and sometimes that can be at the building level. It might be a building principal. It could be somebody like a school psychologist. But most importantly, if you feel like your answers are your questions are not being answered, continue to seek out the best person in the district who can specifically answer your questions. I would also consider asking very specific functional questions, like not just, tell me about what programs you provide, but how do you support students whose reading is, struggling in this way, or for a student who struggles with transitions. You want to feel like you got useful information out of that conversation. And so being as specific as possible only helps the person be specific back with you. And then for me personally, I think a really important question for families to ask about is around flexibilities in the system, right? So you have set programs. You can look at, the website of a district tells you a lot in terms of what they want parents to know and to communicate in terms of what they provide. There should be a lot there. And with that, there's things that you're not going to know. So I highly suggest asking questions around how programs can be flexible to kids as they ebb and flow, either with progress or lack thereof, or with a change of needs, because truly that's what happens in real life once you get there. So all of that to say, really functional, specific, practical based questions so that you feel like you got the information you needed.
Thank you, Liz. I frequently hear from parents because I heard you say somebody in your position or the building principal. A lot
Mhm.
of people think the superintendent is the appropriate person, and I tend to disagree with that because they have a whole other job. So, can you just comment on whether that's the appropriate place to start the journey?
The superintendent?
Yeah.
Likely not. The superintendent is likely to re-refer you back to an assistant superintendent for special education or pupil services or a director of special education or somebody in the specific special education administrative role. Every district has one. And so most superintendents will pivot you back there because the superintendent is not involved in the day-to-day, week-to-week of program evolution and things like that. So that's definitely the case.
Thank you, Liz.
Mhm.
So we've kind of addressed, we want to look at the child versus the district or the placement. So let's talk a little bit about what best district actually means. So Diane, I know we love this question, right? Best district shows up in real estate sites, parent forums, Facebook groups. My favorite, the published articles, top 10 districts in whatever state you're in. Why is that framing so often misleading, especially for families with a child who has special needs?
Um, and it's tricky because I do see this often on Facebook sites, especially, and I do get calls from parents saying, "Where should we move?" And what I've said to them is, "Where do you want to live?" Primarily because you can ask parents in a district and say, "How is your district?" And I'll be looking at Facebook, and 10 people will say, "It's amazing. The team is amazing." Except I've got like 50 clients in that same district where they're all struggling. um, what is best for one family may not be best for another. And when people are saying, "Oh, the district is great," what they usually mean is my child's teacher, my child's speech and language pathologist, my child's principal, the people who are directly with my child on a daily basis are a good fit for my child. Another family within that same school building could have a different teacher, and that isn't necessarily the right fit. The other piece is that even if a family moves into a district because they have this great program for kids exactly like their child's profile, all it takes is a change in instructor, it takes a change in special ed director, a change in superintendent, and everything changes. And the great program that you moved there for, the great special ed director who was so collaborative with families, all of a sudden you may have a totally different ballpark. The other thing is that when districts are reporting stats and saying, "Oh, we're the best in the state for reading," I won't go down that rabbit hole right now, Laura. You don't have to worry about that. But the thing is that that doesn't tell us anything about special education. The best districts, the highest ranked districts, are sometimes the most difficult for children with special needs. They may be more targeted towards garden variety student, um, rather than students who have, particular disabilities. There are some very wealthy districts that are a nightmare for families. And so it just depends um, on the very specific variables that we can't control. And so I tell people, you want to live by the water, live by the water. You want to live in the woods, live in the woods. You decide where you want to live.
Thank you. So Liz, kind of on that same platform of question, in your experience, what do parents most misunderstand about what makes a special education program or a district strong versus just well-resourced or highly ranked according to some of these,
Yeah.
metrics that we see out there?
hmm to me, it's responsiveness, really, because the reality is that there is no district that has every iteration of every inch of programming for every student profile available. It's not feasible. But what defines really strong systems to me is how responsive they are. So how much the team understands the child, how willing they are to adjust when something isn't working, how proactive they are in dealing with that, how collaborative they are when in problem solving. So you can have a system with a lot of resources, but if it's really rigid, that's going to make it a tough situation, and it may not meet your child's needs. So on the flip side, you can have a district that may not be as resourced, but has a culture of responsiveness, flexibility, and collaboration, and that can make the difference.
Thank you. And David, Diane kind of touched on this too. If we have two children with a similar diagnosis or profile, they can need very different environments. Can you give us a sense of how individual fit really works when you've got kids like that?
Absolutely. When we talk about diagnoses, I think we need to understand that the same label or diagnosis could look totally different among two different children, and that could transfer in the classroom. And clinically we call this heterogeneity, meaning different within sort of the same category. So a diagnosis tells us the general category of a child's challenges. Perhaps it's reading, perhaps it's math, perhaps it's social skills, perhaps it's attention, right? But within that, there can be so much variability. So some of the things we want to think about, one is severity of the presentation. I mean, that's important for individual fit. just like two people with diabetes might have a lot of overlap. They might be very different in terms of how serious it is, how on top of their insulin they need to be, everything like that. The same thing occurs here, in that someone might have a very mild, say, learning disability, and another one might have a very severe learning disability, and that's going to have a direct implication on the individual fit of a particular program. Even when we get similar in terms of severity levels, there are still a lot of differences in terms of what I talked about at the beginning, which is the strengths and challenges of the particular child's profile. So, just to use an example, a lot of us talk about dyslexia. There are a lot of kids with dyslexia who have very exceptional spatial reasoning abilities and problem solving skills, and they can use those skills to compensate and really do well with visually busy programs that we see in a lot of dyslexia, these multisensory programs. There might be another child where they're much more verbal kids. They're actually not quite as strong in terms of their visual spatial abilities, and they need to understand things verbally, talk about them. We see the same variability outside of learning disabilities. We see this in more socially, emotionally focused profiles like autism. Certainly, severity is a factor there, but even at similar severity levels, there are significant differences. Some kids with autism are very socially motivated. Others, really want their space, right? So some kids are socially motivated; they just struggle picking up on the cues. Others really, really want their space. And so, for these different kids, the environment that's really the ideal fit might look pretty different. Some kids might want a good deal of peer interaction. Others might really need a lot more in terms of breaks and ability to recharge to avoid burnout, dysregulation, things like that. So, for me, the individual fit, as we talk about, looks past the diagnosis. Not just, oh, this is our autism program, this is our dyslexia program. Really, you want matching the specific aspects of the profile.
Thank you. So Liz, a question popped up talking about responsiveness, and since you addressed that, I think it's a good time. It says, when looking at districts, how might you figure out about the level of responsiveness?
I think you ask specific questions. So examples might be, how do you know the program's not working? What can parents expect in terms of communication or process in reviewing progress? What are your progress monitoring practices? And these should be pretty specific responses. Asking, can you give me an example of what that might look like? Like and I think coming back to like, what can parents expect? It tells me what is the norm, which to Diane's point, not that one-off teacher who happens to have a strength in this area, but what is the typical experience? So I would ask a lot about progress monitoring, case management practices, communication, what the expectation parents can have when students need a shift in their program.
Thank you. And I think we're going to touch on some of that stuff as we get into this. So we kind of talked a little bit about how we're defining best, or how it's being defined out there. And one of the kind of first options is within a school district. And Liz, I'm going to stay with you for a moment. So this question could probably take you an hour to answer. So unfortunately, I have to ask you to keep it kind of brief. But
Okay.
when you walk through the continuum of services, what do they look like? And when I say that, parents hear these words and they may not know that that's what it is. So consultation, push-in, resource rooms, co-taught classrooms, self-contained classrooms, all of these things and others. And are there symptoms that the current one isn't working that causes the districts to kind of consider other varieties of it?
Sure. So when we think about a continuum, it's intended to be dynamic, not static or stuck. If you land in a certain place on the continuum, that doesn't mean that that's where you stay. So I just want to start with that. We're really talking about a range of supports from least intensive to most intensive. A word that you'll hear a lot is restrictive, which is accurate, but it can seem it can seem confusing if you're new to it. So think about it, least intensive to most intensive. So on one end of the continuum with our least intensive supports, you have things like a consultation, and that's just teachers talking together in order to hone best practices specific to what a student needs. So a support specialist, special education teacher, a related service provider with a general education teacher, and that's to make sure that the student has what they need specific to their profile. Then you get to services in the general education setting. That's a push-in service where a support specialist can come into the room for a period of time, and provide service in that setting. Then there's a pull-out, which can be a very short period of time of intensive support, for a specific reason to work on goals and objectives, and then the student returns. A co-taught model, which is extremely popular, is when two teachers teach together, a special educator and a general education teacher. They have different roles, but it really it's intended to be as inclusive as possible, and oftentimes it benefits the entire class. And then you get into more specialized programs that tend to be smaller, more intensive, with a high level of services provided and often a lower adult to student ratio. And then, then you have students who require something very different that the public schools can't provide. And that might be a placement outside of the public schools in a specialized school for a specific reason. They maintain as a public school student. And the district is collaborating with the family around that private school. But the thing to consider is it's not like a ladder you climb that you just keep going in one direction. It's intended to kind of ebb and flow and about finding the right match.
Thank you. And thank you for doing that so succinctly.
I'm sorry, it's
That
been
was not
numbers.
easy. And I like that you talked about intensive, because least restrictive environment's a very confusing term. So it is kind of a level of intensity. So David, when you're evaluating a student, how do you think about matching a child to a point on that continuum when you're considering appropriate supports?
I think we need to look at several factors. It's not necessarily just one thing. And this is something I speak about frequently in our training, our fellowship training program, of which there was just like a manual of just this means this and that means that. It's something where you have to weigh a lot of pros and cons. So one thing, as I said before in the last part of the discussion, severity of the challenges certainly matters. We use standardized testing for this. What we're really asking, and why it's so important to get quantitative data, is how wide is the gap between your child's current skills or levels and the expectation for same age peers, right? So, and of course, it completely depends on what you're measuring. Some kids might be off the charts great in some areas, but then have some surprising gaps in other areas. If a child's only slightly behind, all other things being equal, that suggests that they don't need quite as they're not quite as far on the intensive side as we're talking about of the continuum. They might not require that much pull-out time or time away from their peers and their specials and things like that. And we want to, weigh the benefits of those as well. On the other side, if a child has a very, very substantial gap to make up, then we need to consider moving further. I'm going to recommend something a little bit further along on that continuum. We also need to consider the history of previous services. The background history is really important. That's why every evaluation has a background section, and why districts provide me with records, or parents provide me with records. I want to get a sense, just like if you have a medical issue, the first thing your doctor might ask you, oh, what have you tried before for this? I'm thinking about that in a pretty similar way. So if a child has already tried several different levels on that continuum, several different types of services, more intensive services, data has been collected and the needle is not quite moving, then that is going to lead me to recommend something further, more intensive on that continuum. If a child's making really good progress and there's evidence of that, then less so. The last thing I do think about I mean, there's other factors as well, but the last big thing I think about is how does a child actually look and function during instruction? So here I'm talking about things like attention span, processing, thinking, processing speed, social motivation, um, emotional flexibility. These are a lot of things that, to me, think about how is this child going to extract as much as possible out of the program that's provided to them. If a child is really is really distractible, is thinking at a slower speed than a lot of their peers, and that's affecting their ability to encode that information into their mental filing cabinet and really learn efficiently, then that child might need either a different setting or less intensive, smaller group individual levels of service. On the other side, I've actually found there are a lot of kids who are extremely socially motivated and they actually step up. They're able to step up their levels more when they're around, say, two or three kids that are of similar profiles in their small group instruction. And so that's another thing I consider. So it's really the combination of those three things: severity, efficacy of prior services, and then just sort of the child's style during instruction.
Thank you. So we talked a little bit about, the continuum now. So there's a couple of questions, and our next area is actually how do we investigate a district? So I think it's good timing with the questions coming in. So Diane, you said that when people ask you where should I move, you have a stock answer. If they call you and tomorrow and they say they are choosing between districts or between a neighborhood school and an alternative, what's your initial advice about where they start or what do they look at when considering that?
Yeah, well, and I think someone also asked about, state resources for investigating school districts. There is something in Connecticut called EdSight, EdSight. They include things like profile and performance reports, where you can look up how are their performances in reading, how are their performances in math, how often are they suspending or expelling students? Things along those lines that are really important. There's a restraint and seclusion report on that website, where you can see, is this a district that does a lot of restraint and seclusion, which are, very traumatic for kids. Um, Things like that. So that's the broad picture. And you can look up hearing decisions and see which districts are filing for a hearing or going to hearing every other minute. Very unusual for any district to do it on a regular basis, but there are some who are frequent flyers. So those are some kinds of things that you can look at. In terms of this district versus that district, I agree with Liz that it's a good idea to pick up the phone, talk to the director of special ed, get a sense of transparency. Because I think in addition to flexibility, you also need transparency. How often are parents getting benchmark data? I will tell you that some of my families of children with dyslexia are shocked because they never thought to ask for benchmark data. The district wasn't providing it, for reading, for example. And when we requested, it turns out their child had been struggling for years. And we had that data, but the parents didn't know about it. Now, there are some districts that automatically provide it. There are some districts who will provide it if you ask for it. And then there are other districts that will give you a really hard time before providing it. And so, asking them, how often do parents get this information? And, do a question that I would have that I don't know if I would get a straight answer to, but, do you encourage staff to let parents know if the child is struggling? Do you encourage staff and PPTs to make recommendations? I would anticipate that most administrators would say yes, but you never know. And they'll say yes. I wouldn't necessarily expect that in planning and placement team meetings, but those kinds of things can be helpful. The other thing is if you have, you can ask about different programs. I get nervous about programs within districts. Districts sometimes will try to plug in children into in-district programs. It's like we have our autism program, we have our behavior program, we have our, sometimes we have a learning disabilities program. I guess I would be asking questions like, you know, how many of your students are remediated? You know, if they have a reading disability, do they stay in special ed and get reading instruction for years, or are we remediating them in 1 or 2 years? Things along those lines. If they start talking about the severity of the disability, I always watch out for that one because, in fact, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act talks about needing to identify students regardless of the severity of the disability. When people say, oh, that student, you know, in reading, they're only a year behind in second grade. That's a time that, to me, if it's mild, that means we can remediate it. So let's stop messing around and provide the student with what they need. So I think just asking questions, and not going in assuming the worst, not, you know, school staff, if you're a parent of a child with disabilities, school staff are not your friends. They are not your enemies. It's a professional relationship. And so, you know, what you're looking for are people who will treat you as an equal, who will treat you as though you are an expert on your child, and who are not going to talk down to you, who are going to welcome questions, who are going to welcome your input, and who aren't going to say things to you like, well, we don't see that. We don't see that here. So we can't possibly do anything. You know, so ultimately, I agree with the flexibility. I would also emphasize the importance of transparency.
Thank you. So Naomi, Diane mentioned a couple of resources between EdSite and some hearing decisions. Are there other resources that, from a legal perspective, you're aware of? And does that provide meaningful information as to what can be expected?
Well, one issue is if a parent has gotten so far into the process that they have filed for due process and that case has gone all the way through to decision, you know that they were in a very, very severe situation because most disputes that parents have with school districts don't result in the filing of a due process complaint. And so right there, you are seeing some of the worst, most contentious examples of disputes between parents and districts. And so, that can sometimes skew things, right? With state complaints, yes, that data is published, but it's also summarized. And so you're not getting the complete context, of that state complaint decision as to what was complained about, what was really going on, what were all the violations. You're getting a very succinct summary and, being familiar with some of the actual decisions compared to what was actually summarized, there's often a lot of context that gets left out. And so is it helpful to go on to, CSDE's website, it's Connecticut State Department of Ed, and look at their state complaints? I mean, you can see, because it's listed by district, some districts have a lot of state complaint decisions and some don't, right? So that's helpful to see that at least, you can get a sense for, how satisfied parents are or are not. You also have to take into account the size of the district, right? Presumably larger districts are going to have a larger number of complaints than smaller districts. And so, it might provide you with some issues as to yes, or some insight as to yes, there has been an issue here, but it's not necessarily going to provide you with the complete context. And so I would just say, look at it as a snapshot, but don't really use it as something that you would rely on. A better way, I think, to get information into a district is to look at the money. And so districts, they use public funds, it's public money, and that is something that they keep very, very strict accounting records on. One really fantastic resource here in Connecticut that we have is something called the School and State Finance Project. And they are a wealth of information. You can reach out to them directly. You can say, hey, I have questions regarding my school district. and their budget, and they can help talk you through, those budgets and what everything means. Schools do publish and post information, and you can usually find it in their budget or other places on their websites regarding their legal fees that they expend on special education, their per pupil costs. And so this can also give you an idea for how contentious or non-contentious a district is. And so I would definitely encourage you for more reliable information to look at the money. Um, just to follow up too on Diane's point, yes, they publish, they're required to publish a lot of information or send a lot of information to CSDE, reporting various things, not just, progress, but also restraint and seclusion. Sometimes those reports can be hard to find. Sometimes those reports can be really delayed. And so I would say if you're not finding the information easily, don't give up. You can reach out to CSDE. You can request the information from them. You can say, hey, I'm trying to find information on this. Where can I go? Please help me. And you should get a response. Maybe not immediately, but you should get a response.
So thank you for not only pointing out some vulnerabilities in the system, but also some alternatives that people are probably not very aware of. If you can put the name of the finance organization into the chat, just so people have that, that would be
Yes.
great, or else I'll include it in my follow-up email. But all right, so I think we gave some tools and some references for data. So we're flying through the time, so I want to make sure we cover the really important things. I want to talk about some of the alternatives, alternative schools, magnets, privates, placements, or moving. So almost every family in this situation ends up weighing some version of these four options, right? Staying put, pushing for change, transferring to an alternative or magnet program within their district, going private, or packing up and moving to a new town. And each has different trade-offs, and I kind of want to walk through some of them. So when we're staying within a district magnet school, Liz, can you talk a little bit about the mechanics of transferring to an alternative program or a magnet, and maybe the different, and again, I'm giving you a huge subject and saying we'll do this in 30 seconds, but the difference maybe between a charter and a magnet, if you can touch on that as well, because there are some significant differences.
Yeah, I definitely don't purport to be an expert on charter magnets or school choice overall. It definitely touches within special education, but so I'll do my best. And if any of my panelists here, colleagues, can add on with even more, I welcome that. So let me first say that the IEP, the planning and placement team, right, which is the mechanism that designs the IEP, is what governs the design of the IEP. And that process travels, whether you're in the public school district, in a charter school, or in a magnet school, and your local education agency, your home district, is very much still a part of that, regardless if you're within district or if you're in a charter school or a magnet school, right? So going back to who is my person, who are my people is very important, particularly if you're looking to make a change. And including if you're living in one town and going to a charter or magnet in another. These things matter because your local education agency, your home district is still, a part of that process. So the IEP travels with the student. It doesn't reset, but the placement is still, in terms of the design of that IEP, in a new setting, because inevitably there may be some facets to the school program environment and the rest of it that could impact how that planning and placement team chooses to design the IEP. So coming back into that forum is really important. So I suggest to parents to be really clear on what your timelines are. When does a planning and placement team meeting happen, and the rest of that. So it's not just a logistical decision in the change. There are programmatic conversations need to happen, and that always should happen within the context of the planning and placement team. Magnet school, often, these are public, by the way, these are public, right? They're not necessarily all open. They have a certain amount of availability for enrollment, which changes per school. But a magnet school usually has a very specific type of focus of the school, whether it be a STEM-based school or a performing arts school or the rest of it. Charter school is a different design that I admit I'm not exactly expert in why it's designed in the way it is, but it's also public, but it's also not necessarily open enrollment. We will get a lot of questions from parents around, I wanted to go, but I couldn't go. They didn't have a slot for me, and that's not necessarily uncommon.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So, yep, and that was very small synopsis. There's a lot, we could spend a whole
Yes,
webinar
there's a
on
lot.
that. So,
There's a
but
lot.
thank you very much, Liz, for addressing those so eloquently. So, when we look at private placement, no, Naomi, when parents are considering private placement, there again, we could have a whole webinar on that and the legal framework around tuition reimbursement, prior written notice, 10-day notice rule. Walk us through what parents have to do procedurally in if they're even thinking about going down this path to preserve their rights.
There are three requirements. The first requirement is you have to be able to make a showing that your school district failed to make you an offer of FAPE. The second requirement is you have to be able to make a showing that the program that you have selected is appropriate. And appropriate in the context of a unilateral placement means that it's more likely to result in progress than regression. That's important because it's a different standard than what schools have to reach in order to offer FAPE. The third prong of that is that you acted equitably. And equitably means that you did not do anything that would have obstructed or prevented your school district from offering FAPE. So once you get to that point where you realize that you are disagreeing with the IEP and you want to move on the unilateral placement, if let's say that this happens at a PPT meeting, you're sitting around the table, you're hearing what's being proposed, you know it's not going to work for your child, and that and you disagree with it right there. You can give your unilateral placement notice at that PPT meeting. You can say, I disagree with this IEP because of X, Y, and Z. Therefore, I am placing my child at such and such program unilaterally for the purpose of securing appropriate education, and I expect to be reimbursed for the cost of that. Done, you've given your notice, and then the school district can either say, okay, well, let's come back and let's make some changes and let's see if we can work this out, or they can say, we disagree with what you're saying, and you can move on, you're good to go. Let's say that you've had your PPT meeting, there's been a change, you no longer think that the IEP is appropriate, you're getting your progress reports back, you realize, oh, this is not good, my child's not making appropriate progress. Then what you do is you send in writing to your school district the same statement. I don't believe that my child's making appropriate progress. I intend to enroll my child in such and such place unilaterally. I intend to seek reimbursement. From there, the school has 10 days to either reconvene a PPT and offer a new program, or to tell you, sorry, we disagree, you're on your own. There's an exception if your child is likely to result to have a physical injury or emotional harm, that 10-day requirement, then if it's physical harm, it's waived. If it's emotional injury, then a hearing officer has some discretion as to whether or not you were required to give 10 days. We don't see that too often. But that's the basic legal parameter of it.
Thank you. So we talked a little bit about in-district, we talked a little bit about outplacement. Diane, if we look at moving, moving is the option that parents assume is the cleanest fix. Like, we're just going to start over, right? In your experience, why is moving not usually the answer it looks like on paper?
It absolutely is not the answer it looks like on paper. It often, um, I've had clients move and they've moved to better districts, and then they have found themselves in the exact same problem, with the exact same problems they had previously or worse. There's something to be said for the devil, there are exceptions. There are times where, there's significant bullying or whatever, but then we want to get to the bottom of what's causing the bullying. Is this a social skills deficit? I mean, so there are all kinds of things. Students bullied in one district, they may be bullied in the next district. We just don't know. What I say to people is, if you really want to live in that other town, totally fine. But if you're just moving to try to get to a quote unquote better school district, you could be very disappointed. And Yeah, and I've had people say to me, "Oh, this town is amazing. I've heard so many good things about this town. They're very highly rated." And it may be one of the worst districts currently, in terms of dealing with them for special ed. Of course, that could change next year if they get a new administrator, they get a new teacher. I mean, so yeah, it's a moving target. I generally do not recommend moving for the sake of better services.
Thank you. And David, do you have anything to add to that from a clinical perspective about a major transition in a child's life who's kind of struggling in school and now we're moving? Are there two sides to that coin?
There could be two sides to that coin. I mean, I like Diane's reference of there being exceptions. I do think that a mid-program transition and a mid-year transition, it can carry a pretty significant cost, and by that I mean I'm always thinking more of the social and emotional ramifications of that. I think sometimes parents are when things are not going well with it, and parents are struggling a bit with their district and in relation to how things are going with their child. We let our emotions get in the way because we're human beings, and it happens. And sometimes when we're thinking about all the struggles, we sometimes miss, hey, what might be going well right now? And sometimes things are going well from a social emotional angle, even if, say, from an academic angle, they aren't. And I'm not saying that that's acceptable and we should accept that. I just think that it's important to think about what might be going well. A child might actually have a really good friend group, a good peer group, great extracurricular activities, and and those are important in terms of whether it's athletics or whether it's music or whether it's STEAM. That might be actually bolstering the child's self-esteem really significantly. You pick up and move. You might actually realize that that was a trade-off that you're losing if that is not necessarily available. You also risk losing some of these safe adults for the child. There are some, I mean, I've worked with a lot of different districts. There are some people out there who are true gems, and that one teacher, special education teacher, speech and language pathologist, school psychologist, OT, is really a lifeline for that child, and you need to think about that as well. So again, I'm not saying never. Certainly, there are times where it's warranted. I just always recommend parents like don't forget to think about what might be going well also.
No, that's a great perspective. Naomi, from the legal side, if you do choose to move, are you losing leverage in some way, or is that negatively affecting your argument in the district that you're leaving?
Um, Losing leverage, meaning, I'm sorry.
So if you disagree with what was happening, so you up and move, but you might still want to seek something from the old district, are you losing anything in
Oh,
moving?
yeah, yeah, because they're not required to pay once you're no longer a resident. Um, you have a lot to risk if you move. First of all, if you move out of state, then yes, initially they have to provide comparable services, but they're allowed to go back to an initial evaluation and redetermine eligibility, and then propose a new IEP. If you stay within the state, then they don't do that, and you get the comparable services until they can propose a new IEP. But that's definitely something that you would have to consider.
Thank you. So I think we've touched on all of the options. So if you either stay where you were or you move and things start not going well, Naomi, what are the realistic options at that point? And what should you be documenting from day one in order to document what's happening in any kind of new program that's offered?
Well, the first thing you want to do is keep track of emails that you receive from teachers, um, and and keep those really organized. If teachers telling you, for example, that your child had a really rough day, that they had to leave the classroom, that they were in the separate setting, that they spent the day in the office, that they spent the day in the school psychologist, a room, find out from them. What did they miss? Try to get a sense. Was it more than 90 minutes? If it's more than 90 minutes, that's a big problem. And then how often is this happening, right? So keep track of that data. If your child is coming home and telling you that they haven't received their speech services in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that might warrant a phone call to your school saying, hey, where are the service logs? Let me see what's going on. I'm being told that my child's not being serviced. Um, and so that kind of data you can definitely start collecting on your own. You'll get your progress reports. You should get your progress reports. If you don't get your progress reports, that's a whole other issue, but you should get your progress reports. And, as a parent, you're also going to be wanting to track that, right? Are they making progress? Are they not making progress? And how does this compare to, my previous progress report and my previous IEP? What you don't want to see, over the passage of time is that they're carrying over the same goals, or they are just very slightly tweaking the goals, and that your child's not making any progress.
Thank you. So Liz, if you have somebody that moves into your district and things start not going well, what are the internal processes, whether it's team meetings, facilitated IEPs, informal problem solving, that tend to resolve things before they escalate?
Yeah, well, first off, not waiting, for your team to reach out to you. So if you have a sense of something, reach out and ask. You don't necessarily have to wait for, that they do. And I think being clear, and I feel like I'm a broken record tonight on what parents can expect of what we call case management, which is the communication around the program, the documentation, the ongoing progress monitoring. What are the normal practices that take place? And what do parents receive in terms of communication? And that could just be as part of conversation or in writing. So, and not necessarily waiting until there's an issue to understand what that expectation is of case management. I am always a fan of having a conversation and usually not bringing other folks to the table if there are more than one provider, and making sure the general education teacher is not left out of the conversation. I do see that can turn into a tunnel conversation between parents and special education teachers at times, and making sure the general ed teacher is a part of it. So I would bring in additional perspectives. And in some cases, you have to have a PPT meeting. Not always. If you're going to get into the IEP design, most definitely you need to be in a PPT. But if you're brainstorming, reviewing data, and you're not really looking at the design of the IEP, but calibrating, talking about shared strategies between home and school, most definitely having a conversation. And if you can do it in person, even better.
Thank you. And David, if they are in a program and things aren't going well, when should you consider updating any evaluative information?
No, I feel like a broken record as a clinician. I feel like I say this way too often, but it depends.
That's a
It
lawyer's
really,
answer, right, Naomi?
you have to think about kind of like what we were speaking about earlier. You need to think about what are the more vulnerable points of the child's profile where they need the majority of their programming. So, an example, something like a reading disorder, the numbers matter a lot. Not that quantitative data isn't helpful for essentially all types of neurodevelopmental challenges. That's a situation where I do think that that more frequent robust progress monitoring is important. And by progress monitoring, there are different types. There's ways of seeing if you're the percent correct of different types of reading different types of words is increasing and improving, and that's great. What that isn't telling you though is this child bridging the gap relative to their peers? So perhaps a year ago they were only doing as well or better than 5% of their peers. Well, maybe a year later, they're doing as well or better than 10% of their peers, right? So not only are they making progress, they're narrowing that gap. So for that gap is just so important to measure. So for the reading, for some of those reading and academically related challenges, I like a shorter interval for updating the evaluation. Sometimes for really significant social, emotional, and behavioral needs, that level of frequent testing isn't necessary or entirely helpful. Kids vary in terms of their receptiveness through going through the testing process. I mean, like I think it's fun, and otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. And many kids think it's fun. Also, they enjoy the adult attention. Many kids don't though, and I think that in a lot of situations where those key points are around more the social and emotional area, um, that's where the new set of test scores is not going to get you that much, and it's not necessarily time well spent for the child. In some of those situations, rather than rushing for, say, a full neuropsych reval, often I've had good experiences when districts want to bring in just an outside professional for consultation. I've done that before where, I might come in and observe the child again, speak with the team, speak with the parents, get a sense of, where are we falling behind here? And that way, we're getting, I enjoy adding another perspective, and it's not necessarily at such a significant cost to the child.
Terrific. Thank you. We are just at the end of our time, so I just want to end with a little bit of a lightning round. If you could each just give us one takeaway, the single most important thing you would want parents to carry away from tonight's conversation. David, I'll start with you.
Yeah. I think that several of us have touched on this, and I just think that collaboration with a school district, like that's the secret sauce to really help a child. And I know, Liz, you spoke at length about this. That initial phone call, if those people are kind of leaning in and listening and wanting to learn more, I think I think that's a really positive indicator. If you get well, we don't do that here, or we just do this X, Y, and Z, that's a little bit less strong of a first impression. So to me, that collaboration is key.
Thank you. Liz?
Um, Building off of David, and I think combining before the responsiveness of a district, I would definitely, stick with that. Not necessarily always getting it right, but how communicative and responsive they are. And I would say that what Diane added before in terms of transparency, that you're getting clear responses to questions and answers. And when somebody doesn't have that information, that there's a follow-up that makes sense to you.
Thank you. Diane?
I always recommend that families know to document everything to ensure clear communication. If something is not in writing, it never happened. If district staff are calling you about problems rather than emailing you, it's always really important to do a polite follow-up email, even if it's just to that person to say, thank you so much for calling me to let me know that my child tried to strangle another child on the playground, whatever it is. And to also reach out to ask for help. I agree that collaboration can be a double-edged sword. That's actually often used. I've just heard it used against parents. Oh, you're not being collaborative because you're asking questions. You're making requests, and I just want to caution people it's not collaborative just because you're asking questions, just because you're saying, I don't agree. Reasonable, intelligent people sometimes don't agree, and that's totally fine. So I guess my second thing, put it in writing. My second thing is get comfortable with conflict and keep it professional.
Thank you. And Naomi?
You are your child's best and first advocate. So keep your expectations high, advocate at teams, and do your research. Know your data about your school district and about your child's progress.
Thank you. I really want to thank all of our panelists. I think this was a really interesting and informative discussion. As I mentioned, this topic comes up a lot and there are no direct answers, but hopefully we're able to give you some resources and some ideas of how to move forward. So I am working on the webinar series for next school year, and I'm very excited about some of the topics to come. We should have our first one in September 2026. And as of right now, I'm thinking the topic is how to start the school year off strong. So thank you for watching and your support of Special Education Legal Fund. And I hope everyone has a great night. And I really sincerely thank our panelists. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having me.